Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archives to Earbuds, Telling Our Stories. I'm Jeremy Helton, a podcast audience development consultant and the coordinator of the Archives to Earbuds discussion series, of which today's event is the first. Our next Archives to Earbuds panel discussion, Podcast for Cultural Institutions, will take place online only next Monday, October 30th, and the third panel discussion, Podcast as Cultural Artifact, will take place online only next Thursday, November 2nd. I'd like to thank all of you who are joining us online today and for all of you who are joining us in person here at the Center for Jewish History. And thanks to CJH, the Podcast Academy, the Association of Independents in Radio, and of course, the Leo Baeck Institute for making this discussion series possible. Working with Leo Baeck Institute to promote the first season of their podcast, Exile, got me thinking about how effectively LBI and their production partners, Antica, were able to bring the LBI archives to life, engaging existing patrons, scholars, and visitors, along with new audiences that may never have discovered these unique individual stories of Jewish lives under the shadow of fascism. The Exile podcast inspired the Archives to Earbuds series, which we hope will foster greater discourse and, fingers crossed, partnership between cultural institutions, archives, and podcast professionals. And today's moderator and panelists have a lot or know a lot about the opportunities and the challenges of telling these often undershared stories via podcasts. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator and our panelists. Natalia Petrzela is a historian of contemporary American politics and culture. She is an associate professor of history at the New School and the author of Classroom Wars, Language, Sex, and the Making of Modern Political Culture, and also Fit Nation, The Gains and Pains of America's Exercise Obsession, out now as an audiobook. Yes, hardcover, yeah. And hardcover. You'll have to wait until April for paperback. Finally, she is also co-producer and host of the acclaimed podcast, Welcome to Your Fantasy, about the Chippendales, but about so much more than just the Chippendales, and the co-host of the Past Present podcast. David Brown is the director of public history here at LBI, where he edits the website, newsletter, and other publications and organizes LBI's public programs, including lectures, panel discussions like this one, film screenings, and performances. He also works on special projects, including exhibitions and the launch of LBI's podcast, Exile, narrated by Mandy Patinkin, and LBI Presents, hosted by Mark Oppenheimer. Eric Marcus is a journalist and the author and co-author of dozens of books, including Making Gay History and Breaking the Surface, the #1 New York Times best-selling autobiography of Olympic diving champion Greg Louganis. Eric is co-producer of Those Who Were There, a podcast drawn from Yale University's Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, and is also the founder and host of the award-winning Making Gay History podcast, which mines his decades-old audio archive of rare interviews to bring LGBTQ history to life through the voices of the people who lived it. We also have Julie Golia, a historian of media and gender, an acclaimed curator and an award-winning educator. Currently, she is the Associate Director of Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books, and the Charles J. Liebman Curator of Manuscripts at the New York Public Library. Julie is also the author of Newspaper Confessions, A History of Advice Columns in a Pre-Internet Age. What's that? And before coming to New York Public Library, she oversaw curatorial affairs and collections at Brooklyn Historical Society, now known as the Center for Brooklyn History, where she co-hosted and co-produced the Flatbush+Main podcast with educator and oral historian Zahir Ali. And finally, Virginia Millington is Managing Director, Recording and Archive at StoryCorps, a nonprofit organization which aims to record, preserve, and share the stories of Americans from all backgrounds and beliefs, and amplify those stories during weekly broadcasts on NPR, via animated shorts on PBS and YouTube, and also through the StoryCorps podcast. She currently oversees the team responsible for maintaining the organization's mobile and stationary recording venues across the country and archiving thousands of StoryCorps interviews each year. Please welcome Natalia, David, Eric, Julie, and Virginia.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for everyone here watching from home and here, and of course, for these wonderful panelists. So, okay, here's my first question. I've been selfishly waiting to hear what you all have to say about this. So we all know, one of the most appealing aspects of the podcast medium is how expansive it is. It's so different from a quick news segment or even a radio show. However, we all know that you have to make so many decisions about what to include and what not to include. It doesn't feel expansive at all when you're cutting, a tape and making a story very concise. And so I'm curious to follow up on a question that David raised in some remarks, conversation we had before this, which is how do you each find a balance between sharing the stories that are like the juiciest and the most sensational? How do you balance that with the responsibility to either represent the full scope of what you find in your research or that an archive includes, and of course with the historical record? So I don't know if you want to start because you raised this issue, but jump in, it's a conversation.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So the Leo Baeck Institute got into the podcast game relatively recently. I think about a year ago, almost exactly, we started releasing the first episodes of Exile. And so we have 12 under our belt now. And the experience, I shouldn't generalize about working at archives because I've only worked at Leo Baeck Institute. But it's been 13 years now, and one of the things that I know is that everyone at LBI has like a favorite story. They're sort of or a handful of pet stories that either are quirky in some way or they're very there's some fundamental irony that they're surprising, um, or they're just really great stories that are richly documented. And so um, it was easy to pick 12 stories that we knew would really work as stories for our first seasons. Um, but I also have some qualms about that act of selection, because if you take, for instance, a story everyone here loves about Kurt and Helen Kleinman. So Kurt Kleinman was a young Jew from Vienna who wrote to other people named Kleinman. The legend is that he got the New York City phone book and just started writing to people. And one of the people who opened the letters was Helen Kleinman, 25-year-old Jewish American, who responded. They started writing to one another, and of course, they fell in love, got married, and Kurt, was able to emigrate to the United States. And of course, this is like the least typical story of German Jewish refugee experience that you could come up with.
But you couldn't not tell
Yeah.
that story.
Right, exactly. So I think the approach that we try to take is to use, this very extraordinary story that's full of coincidences and, you know, maybe couldn't be, maybe it's completely unique. But it gives you an opportunity to talk about, the restrictive immigration regime in the United States, the impact of the experience of Nazi persecution on people's decision making about marriage and family and career, and how for 99% of people it didn't have this kind of fairy tale ending. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there and let other people talk, but I think it's about taking those extraordinary stories and then finding a way to kind of pack some history and some context around them.
Yeah, the scripting, it sounds like
Yeah.
it's really important for that context. Do you, any of the rest of you want to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, it's we each do different things,
Right.
but at its core, you have to tell a good story. So I have in my archive from a book that I wrote, I was commissioned to write in 1988. I have more than 100 interviews from the 2 editions of the book. Some of those interviews are only okay, and I can't extract a good narrative and a good story. It has some of the stories have historical merit, but they're not good enough for the podcast, so I don't use them. On the other hand, there was one interview in particular. Many people who were involved in LGBTQ history and actually know anything about the LGBTQ civil rights movement They know Marsha P. Johnson, who is an iconic figure, an iconic trans figure who was involved in the immediate Stonewall, post-Stonewall era, was at the Stonewall Uprising. The interview I did with Marsha was an accident. I actually went to interview, I'll skip the whole story because it's too long, but I went to interview somebody else, and Marsha happened to be that person's roommate. That person had insisted I go with him back to his apartment to do the interview, and who's making dinner but Marsha P. Johnson.
Oh my God.
Marsha was in a t-shirt and jeans. Did I know who Marsha was? Maybe. This is in 1989. So Marsha sits down. This is with Randy Wicker, who was, I don't know if Randy was on, Randy was speaking a mile a minute, and Marsha was speaking in slow motion and not always clearly. Not nearly enough to use for an oral history book. Not nearly enough, but perfect for a podcast. And did I feel bad about editing out most of Randy's part? No, because a podcast is a specific thing. And if people want to go to the archive, which exists at the New York Public Library, they can listen to the whole thing. I think at core, I think of your work at StoryCorps, 3 minutes. And I'm really curious how you manage that, because I can't.
It's an interesting question, and I actually spent some time prior to this panel talking to our extremely talented group of producers who make the podcast. And Max Younggeist was telling me that the podcast, in many ways at StoryCorps, represents a way to add complexity to the traditional model that StoryCorps is known for, the 3-minute interview. And then that podcast allows just a little bit more complexity, a story to be developed in a way that allows for a meandering path. And none of the podcasts or the broadcast interviews that we are known for and that represent sort of the easiest access point to StoryCorps interviews are longer than 20, 25 minutes, but they do represent a real variety in terms of how a story can be told. And I think for us, the podcast allows StoryCorps producers to take a moment in a longer interview and follow that to its natural conclusion and create something that is maybe a story that might not naturally evolve from an interview as it happens.
And I think there's something also that complicates this even more, which is when you're working with historical archival audio that was recorded before the concept of podcast was even known to us. I think, for example, about some of the oral histories that we worked with at Brooklyn Historical Society that were with early Puerto Rican families in the neighborhood in the 1970s. There is like a church bell in the background and the dog is barking. I mean, it is like your worst case scenario for audio production, but that's data, right? And so one thing I think that is very exciting to me is when podcasts, and we tried to do this very much with Flatbush+Main, when we can push the envelope a little bit on a preconceived expectation of a very neatly told story to leave in background sound or even engage with it. I think something like pauses in oral histories are incredibly important. Most audio editors want to cut that right out and get to the meat of it, but the pause is the point. We recently did a project at New York Historical Society about chronicling stories of COVID, and I was amazed at how many elegies to past parents people sent in, and the silences were the point. And I think if we can kind of come right up to the edge of audience willingness to engage with that, how uncomfortable that is, there's real learning opportunities in that as well.
May I just follow up on that?
Absolutely.
The silence, what you can do in a podcast is so different from what you can do in print.
Yeah.
So my producer, Sarah Birmingham, who actually came up with the idea for the podcast, called me one day to say, oh my God, that scene with you in the car with Morty Manford, who's the son of Gene Manford, co-founders of PFLAG. She said that silence. And I had no memory of that from 30 years ago, but it was when I was asking Morty about people in his life who had been dying from AIDS. I thought he might be ill, and I was trying to ask every which way if he had AIDS without actually asking him. And in the silence, which we could use in the podcast, because an ellipsis, ... in the book doesn't do it. We could do that in a podcast. And that background sound, even if it's annoying sometimes and it makes it harder to edit, is very atmospheric.
Absolutely. I think that quest for like the perfect audio that sounds like it was recorded in a studio is often so ill-founded for anyone maybe but the host who's tracking over it. I think that's so right. And also I think this reminder that all of your comments speak to that, an oral history interview, some of it will be perfect for the podcast. In other ways, it can be used for the book or it can be context for your scripting is really important to remember. That's actually, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say this was something that came up for us during the pandemic because we moved our interview recording practices from an in-person model, recording in sound booths, aiming for really, really high quality sound, to something where we were recording over a virtual environment. And what we found was that it was most important in the decisions that were made around that. Those platforms were really about access and making sure that people could record those interviews, even though the audio quality really declined. And I would say that those interviews, as remembrances, as a record of people's experiences during that time, are incredibly powerful.
Especially if they're sitting at home telling you
Right.
this, right? That's amazing.
With their children screaming in the back.
Yeah.
Well, some audio is truly imperfect, but that's actually a good, I think, a good transition. Eric, something that you said in the earlier comments that you shared that I thought was so interesting. So you're involved in at least two rather different podcasts. That Making Gay History is based on these intimate interviews that you did with all of these people and now will exist in podcast form. But then you also work or have created Those Who Were There, Voices from the Holocaust, which you produced for Yale University. And it's based on a Holocaust testimony archive that you did not, you didn't do those interviews. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about distance, intimacy, and how maybe that presents different challenges. And all of you, I'm sure, have some things to say about this.
I think there was an advantage to working with the Fortunoff archive in that I had distance.
Right.
I didn't know these people,
Mhm.
and their stories are very challenging to listen to. And I'm also very fortunate that I hired my co-producer, Nahani Rouse, who produces Can We Talk for the Jewish Women's Archive. Nahani does all of the long listening. I actually had vowed, having grown up in a neighborhood of Holocaust survivors and war refugees, that I would never have anything to do after my 20s and knowing enough with anything related to the Holocaust, because I just couldn't tolerate it.
Yeah.
So and here I am doing a Holocaust podcast. So I've tried to keep some distance, and the fact that they're not my interviews makes it easier. But just as an added point about content, these are videotaped interviews. So once you've got the recording, you can strip out the audio to do what you wish. We also made a short documentary, video documentary, drawn from that archive. Much harder to cut video than audio.
Yeah.
But there are all kinds of things to do once you have the archive, which is what you look after. With my own interviews, it's much harder to let go of things when you have to cut them. I can be much more, and Nani has listened to all of the interviews we're currently using for a 10-part audio documentary on what happened to the Jewish community of Vilna, Poland. It's a horrible story, but through the stories of 14 people, it's much harder for Nahani even to cut because she's listening to everything. So she does depend upon me, I think, sometimes to be more ruthless. But it's often painful because you can't, I feel we can't go beyond 25 to 30 minutes per episode.
Right.
And so you have to be ruthless, not as ruthless as you are at StoryCorps. And I wonder if you experience that with your episodes, that you have to cut things that you really wish you didn't have to.
I think the answer to that is complicated because we do create an archive of broadcast pieces that are very short, and I think that the production department really has a philosophy of, editing to, create and maintain the heart of any story. And so I think, in service of that, the interviews and the broadcast interviews that we create are as long as they should be. But we also have an archive, and I know we'll get into this, that is, that is open to the public. And so we also invite, and hope that our audiences will dive into our archive of interviews and listen to the full 40-minute interviews or listen to multiple interviews at one time. So I think for us, it's a combination of offering that accessible point of entry to the interviews and creating a piece that's 3 minutes long and that can be heard and digested and really maintains an impact and power. And then, hopefully inviting people to, involve themselves in the archive and the longer form interviews.
Were you going to say something, David, before? Yeah.
Yeah, well, with regard to oral histories, that's actually something that remains relatively untapped in LBI's approach to our podcast. We do have hundreds of oral histories that have been collected over the last 20-some years by young volunteers from Austria who are part of a conscientious objector program. So we have all that audio, and then there's another collection of oral histories from the Research Foundation for Jewish Immigration, which was part of a sort of refugee association that these interviews were conducted in the 70s in a slightly more professional way. We haven't made much use of them, though. Actually, most of our sources have been textual, but our podcast has a lot of voiceovers where actors will read excerpts from correspondence, and that's, I mean, for an archive that always faces the challenge, you know, when we put on an exhibition, we have all these things that feel so amazing and so special and important, and they really are to us. But when you put them under glass, they don't really do much
Right.
for a visitor. And you know, even digital access doesn't provide quite the oomph that that an actor reading something will. So that has been an exciting and I think really effective tool for you know, bringing uh, uh, I'll use the word authentic voices into historical narratives.
Yeah, and I think an affective tool there too, that like maybe, oh, a box number in a finding aid is not so enticing, but someone hears that voiced over story and they're like, wait, I want to know more about this. And all of a sudden you have enough sort of motivation to go find that. Yeah.
And I just want to add one more thing. Listening to you talk about the sort of excruciating choices that have to be made in editing. Um, I mean, I'm always amazed actually by the amount of stuff that our producers are able to pack in. I'm not actually sitting there in, you know, Pro Tools or whatever, making the cuts and the hard decisions. But, you know, we'll do a bunch of research and deliver this to our very capable, this material to our very capable producers at Antica, and they'll come back with something where I'm actually surprised at how much we were able to fit in. And I think the nature of the medium itself, I mean, our episodes are about 30 minutes, but that's 30 minutes with no commercials. And it's, you know, pretty tightly scripted. And the audience that we're able to reach with those 30 minutes it just doesn't compare to anything we've ever done. I mean, if you look at our YouTube or our social media, we're not actually able to get people to engage with our stories for that long. And so you actually can tell, it sort of undercuts the premise of my comment that the first question was based on. Um, but I think a fundamental aspect of the medium is that there is so much space actually compared to a lot of other ways that you could try to reach, you know, the number of people that you can through podcasts.
More people than a scholarly journal article behind a paywall? I don't believe it. Yeah. As a professor, I said, go ahead, Eric. Yeah.
That was the reason I heard from Stephen Nairn, who's the executive director at YIVO, and not YIVO, at YIVO's here, at the Fortune Archive. He was looking for someone to provide a window into his archive in the same way that I had provided a window into my Making Gay History archive. I have a little archive. They have 4,100 or 4,400 recorded testimonies, because he knew that, and he suspected that they could give access to the general public in a way that the public does not make access. They had mostly scholars using their archive. I know there are times there's tension between what we do as producers of podcasts and what the archive feels comfortable with, because they're an academic institution. So we're often pushing the envelope with voiceover by actors when the testimony is given by others, or is a printed document that has to be voiced. So it's an interesting tension between the commercial aspects, the public aspects, and yeah.
It's actually a great transition, but I know, Julie, you wanted to speak to this issue, or
Well,
yeah.
it's funny as I think about this. I think actually one of the great one of the great values of podcasts is the idea of saying, let us pull back the curtain and show you how the sausage is made, right? And so there's a way that a podcast actually can reveal something about history, but if it's done quite well, it reveals how that history is made, right? So, the archive box number 28 isn't that interesting, but if you're describing the process by which you opened the archive box, this is the collection that the institution may have had. I'm making up the story right now. For 100 years, and nobody had opened that box, and they found the thing.
Yeah.
They waded through so much material, and they found the thing they needed to find. That's a remarkable story, but it also tells you something about the practice, the methodologies of history, and it does make the process and the experience of history democratized in a way that very few other media can do.
Oh, totally. That careful, or like opening I mean, we're using all these window metaphors, right? But like letting it be seen the process as opposed to like a perfectly crafted paragraph where you have no idea what it took to get in there. I totally agree. Actually, speaking of access, I wanted to raise a question, Julie, that you brought up, which is, we all, and we're already doing it, we talk about podcasting as this democratic medium, and you just need a USB mic and you can privilege all these, marginalized voices. And you're all sort of knowingly laughing, so we can push back on that for sure. One specific thing I think is so interesting that you raised, which is that that's true, but most of us are for distribution pretty much, at the behest of these large commercial platforms. And like your podcast, Flatbush+Main, used to be on everything, and right now it's on the SoundCloud of the institution that made it. And so, you don't need to get into the nitty gritty if you don't want to about that, but this is a big issue, right? I'm curious, what do you all think?
Yeah, it's like all about capitalism, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
We can
let's
leave
make
now,
a
yeah.
play. There's sort of like a let's make a podcast. And granted, we started, conceiving of Flatbush+Main about 10 years ago, so the field has changed dramatically. But it's really hard to indie produce a podcast. I actually think there's a lot of parallels here. I study journalism. There's a lot of parallels to the corporatization of journalism, right? And so I think there is a question of like, if you make it, will they come? It's incredibly difficult to do that without the infrastructure of a platform, and particularly as the kind of the homegrown or the open source platforms are changing so significantly, and there's a really significant amount of corporate consolidation around them. I don't actually know that you could do what we did 10 years ago today, or I mean, you could, but for whom, right? And I think we all, part of the reason why we're all chuckling is because a podcast comes out as this like wonderful, neat little biscuit. It is enormously difficult to produce a podcast. It is a lot of work. And I remember my co-producer and we would always just be like, okay, one's done. Okay, we're up for the next one. It was the clock. It just never ended. A clock that we loved, but I do think like there is a question about input and output in relation to the market of podcasts that is really worth interrogating.
Yeah.
We have a nonprofit. We use the nonprofit model. So Making Gay History is a nonprofit 501c3.
Okay.
Without, I'd never run a nonprofit, let alone create one, because it's so complicated.
Yeah.
We started 7 years ago. I don't think we could do this as well today. We were first to the market with an LGBTQ history podcast, which is a specific interest, and I had an archive to work from.
Right.
And even then, when people ask how much does it cost to do your episodes, $10,000 to $15,000 an episode, and that includes what we do on our website, which is additional information. But that doesn't include the administrative piece, which almost nobody wants to fund. So it's when most people come to me and say, "I'd like to do a podcast. What do you think?" I almost always say, "Don't." I heard from an academic institution. They love the Holocaust podcast that we do, and the question was, we're interested in doing this. And I said, "Do you know how much this will cost you?" And he said, "No, that's why I'm calling." I never heard from him again. So I laid out the costs, and I imagine even for your 10 episode season, it's costly.
It's very costly. I mean, we were very fortunate to be able to do it in the ambitious way that we did. But I think the thing to emphasize is that it reflects an institutional priority. The Leo Baeck Institute was first and foremost, when it was founded, a scholarly history writing enterprise. The Institute in New York became a collecting institution, sort of in service of that history writing mission, had a certain community role while the German Jewish refugees generation was still around and could be active in the institute. And the this shift into what we're describing internally and increasingly externally as a shift into not just collecting, not just access, but storytelling, actually getting involved in transmitting the history directly to the public. That is a reflection of, a deliberate strategic decision by an institution, and we have to raise funds and dedicate staff time around it, and it's not something that can be done on the side.
Right.
It makes perfect sense for institutions to create podcasts.
Yeah.
You don't expect to make money on it. It's
Yeah.
something you do as a service. For people who want to do podcasts and think they're going to make a lot of money commercially, that's a whole other business. It's using podcasting as a way of telling stories, but it's a completely different business model and reason for doing it.
Yeah, and I think there's the labor of making the podcast and also the like, if you actually want listeners,
Oh my God.
that's really hard too. I mean, the past present, we started in 2015 and it really was just USB mics and free software and we've kind of just uploaded it to iTunes and that was it. Today, when people give me the same question, oh, I want to start a podcast, I'm like, do not do it that way because you can make it, but you will have nobody unless you're a celebrity. Yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, so I have this question, Virginia, that came from your remarks, which I thought were so interesting. StoryCorps is so unique. Talk about audience, NPR, YouTube, the 3-minute bits that you talked about too. And then now you also have this commitment to making these stories you collect available at the American Folk Life Center and also now online. And I'm so curious if you can talk a little bit more about that availability and transparency. That's much more transparent than the disciplines of history or journalism. How's it going? Talk to me about that.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah.
I do think StoryCorps is unique in that from the very beginning, I think there has been a commitment to making sure that our participants, the people that take part in the StoryCorps interviews, have access to their own interviews because we know that these recordings are seen almost as family heirlooms. They're precious to the people that record them. And so, we started in 2003, and it's interesting to look back at media history. The easiest way that we found to do that after about 10 years was to think about making the contents of our archive more accessible. And we wanted to serve our participants first and also make it possible for other audiences, for educators, for listeners, for StoryCorps fans to access that archive. And I would say that, looking back now, when we made the decision to put our interviews online, freely accessible, that happened in 2019, but work for that began in about 2009. And what we were really committed to was making sure that everyone in our archive, to the best of our ability, understood the implications of that work. And I think that, my colleagues sitting on the stage here will understand too that in 2009, the idea of making things accessible online was a much different proposition. And I love sharing this story, and I'm happy to do so now. We were so prepared for there to be a negative response to making the interviews accessible that we did 10 years of prep work. And to this day, what we've seen from our participants instead is a real willingness and sincerity in engaging with their own historical record. So instead of writing to us asking questions about why their interview is online, they'll write to us to say, can you add a keyword so that it makes it clear that this interview was recorded in remembrance of a person?
Wow.
Or they'll write us to say, you spelled this place name wrong. We need to correct that. So what we found, and this was very surprising to us, and perhaps it shouldn't have been, was that there was a sincerity and an interest in having those materials made available online.
That's so interesting because you could imagine a sort of online privacy narrative that would suggest
Yeah.
people would be very uncomfortable. But then we've also seen in this exact period of time, maybe this affects sort of all of your work, there's much more interest in sort of family history and using these online tools, Ancestry.com and 23andMe. And I wonder if that has something to do
Well,
with
what,
that.
what I would say just briefly is that we also put in place a lot of tools to allow participants to have autonomy and ownership over how their interviews were presented. So the interviews in the StoryCorps online archive, the participants can change who can view them. They can remove them from the archive. We try to be responsive as much as possible to participant wishes and try to respond within 24 hours. So I think just, for us being available to our participants and really trying to maintain that trust has been critically important.
That sounds to me like it was successful because you put that care in, right? Like it was the 2019 to the 2019 that made it work. I actually think this captures so perfectly like one of the great tensions of everything that we're talking about, which is this sort of this balance of preserving something, and that preservation may be the digital file. It also may be the privacy and the stories, and in some cases the safety of the people who we're interviewing, but also understanding that on the flip side, people know exactly what they're doing, right? And there is a real social history motivation behind oral history as a practice that is about the documentation of histories that are not documented anywhere else and may never be documented. And people have very, very keen sense that they're participating in that. We've been thinking about this a lot we have a remarkable collection at the library, Transoral History Project. And in the process of ingesting these oral histories and making them available online, we've reached out to all 200 narrators to confirm their informed consent that this would be the case. And we were very concerned about privacy, and particularly around safety, and overwhelmed at the response being, oh my gosh, I'm part of the record. This story needs to be told. My story needs to be told. And that was a really affirming experience.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, it is the experience all of us that have done oral histories when you talk to someone who's not, a famous person, and they just feel very seen, that you think their experience is something that should be part of the historical record. So it can make some of those access issues less thorny than maybe we imagine. Okay, so I'm curious. I mean, I could talk to you guys all day, but I'm curious about partnerships with like educational institutions beyond who you're working with. Eric, you look like you have something to say.
This is perfect timing.
Yes.
I don't know if my notes say that we have a.
No, I'm just going from all the interesting things you've brought up. So yeah.
About a year ago, we started a conversation with the National Education Association, which is the largest teachers union in the US, 3 million teachers, with an eye toward developing lessons anchored by Making Gay History podcast episodes that could then be incorporated into the American history curriculum for 11th grade students. They were very excited by this idea. Long story short, they're fully funding a fellowship program. We have 18 teachers. We've just started working with them from around the country. We will work with them on developing these lesson plans. They will go back and teach them first semester of next year. And then they'll come back again and refine those lessons. And then in July of next year, the NEA will release those lessons to their 3 million members. We'll have it on our website, which means it'll be available to teachers everywhere. Second step will be to develop a guide for the teachers to teach this. But they're already looking at a second year of doing this. And I see the same kind of opportunity for the Holocaust podcast too, that these oral histories have a way to animate history in a way that so elevates the experience of learning history that we didn't have when we were kids. Just as a quick example, Mr. Federbush, 7th grade, sat at the front of the room at Russell Sage Junior High School in Queens, and he read from the textbook, the most boring class I have ever heard. The only thing I remember from his class for an entire school year was when he mentioned that he was in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. And we tried to get him to answer questions about that experience, and he wouldn't tell us. But I've watched students in classes where I've presented and shared audio clips, and I've seen their faces and how riveted they are by the human voice. I know we've all had this experience with audio, that it has a way of tapping into our experience that nothing else does when it comes to conveying information.
It's fantastic. I hope that every state will allow you to use those wonderful teaching tools.
Well, they won't. They won't.
Yeah.
We have, the teachers represent 18 states.
Mhm.
I think we do have one from Florida.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
I'm curious, do the rest of you have experiences with kind of K through 12 institutions, or these being used in the classroom, even college classrooms?
We developed a number of oral history-based curricula, not podcasts, but oral
Mhm.
history-based. But I actually think one thing is very important about this process is actually what it means to listen. I think that oral history offers an opportunity to practice empathic, deep, slow listening with students in a way that they have no other opportunity and experience to do that. And in fact, the nature of school today kind of pushes against that concept. And I think the other thing that we did some really wonderful work with at the Brooklyn Historical Society was empowering students to take oral histories.
Mhm.
And actually, I will say that was almost like making it a podcast in the sense that it was so much prep. It is actually very difficult, as many of us know, to interview people. But the idea that they could make and shape the historical record as a practitioner, not just as a narrator, was incredibly powerful. I think the great tension of this, and I think that's why it's so amazing to hear the impact of what you're doing in terms of the breadth, is that in our experiences, it was depth work and it wasn't scalable. Do you know what I mean? And so I think there's a way that those kind of models can work together, that you have a real widespread access and opportunity through curricula and other things. But then there are also these more targeted opportunities for workshop-based work.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
I'm just taking notes because
Ah.
it's like, we gotta get on all this. I mean, we have started in recent, Leo Baeck Institute has started in recent years doing these kinds of workshops with educators. We hosted one with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum this January, and in November we have a group of teachers affiliated with the Defiant Requiem Foundation, which is dedicated to the history of Theresienstadt in particular, who are going to come and work with memoirs primarily. So we have a lot of memoirs written by survivors, and many of them composed in English. So they have that advantage of being accessible in that way. And I think the exciting opportunity that we're going to have to explore is how we can take the audio content from our podcast and exploit it in the same way, and also find ways to draw those connections between the story and the sources,
Mhm.
which I think as a collecting institution, as an archive, is really important to us. I mean, it's kind of you know it's like the part of the iceberg that's below the water, and we're up there, kind of waving our banner on with the podcast on the visible part. But I mean, there's a staff of a dozen or so people engaged full time in processing these collections, in digitizing them, in taking all those notes that come in and correcting the finding aids when someone finds their family name misspelled or a date is wrong, all the kinds of things you're discussing. So yeah, it's a world of exciting possibility.
Yeah, I think the lesson plans for K through 12, that's phenomenal. And talk about scalability and just an important pedagogical contribution. I also think about, myself as a college professor and how strange and unfortunate it is that there is not that much of an embrace of assigning podcasts or audio material in classes. And I mean, I am deep in the podcast world, like I should be at the leading edge. And I'm like reminding myself always when I assign a great history podcast, oh my God, I have to shout out the Sexing History podcast. I just assigned their episode on American Bandstand and like the hidden like racial and queer history of that show. I mean, these students, some of them had probably never read the chapter I assigned in all semester. We're like alive, And I'm just thinking, a little bit based on your comments that I think some of that hesitation comes from the fact that, if you're on the conventional tenure track, like, is this a real scholarly product here? Which I think is bananas because it takes as much work really as working on a book. And I don't know if those are conversations that any of you are in about historians of the conventional sense using these materials. Yeah.
I think there's real
yeah.
tension.
Yeah.
Even just writing my oral history, I'm a journalist by training. I'm not an academic historian. So in the queer history world, I'm never invited to anything. I don't have the credentials. I'm a citizen historian. But back to the college student thing for just a second.
Yeah.
I worked with a professor at, actually, someone who trains teachers at CUNY, the City University of New York, to create a guide for CUNY professors funded by Con Ed, go figure,
Okay.
to help professors incorporate the Making Gay History podcast into what they do, because we can't assume that professors who grew up in a different generation
Right.
will know how to use podcasts in an academic setting. And I'm sure there is some resistance because podcasts aren't always academically grounded.
Yeah.
One thing I would say too is to sort of flip that question on its head. In 2015, we launched an app, and alongside that, a program that we called the Great Thanksgiving Listen, and that had been going on a little bit before, but that was encouraging high school students to record interviews with elders. And we have tens of thousands of interviews at this point through that program. And I think that in some ways, all those people who recorded interviews, through a school assignment or as part of that project may in fact be burgeoning scholars or academics or users of these materials in training. And so I like to think of that as a pipeline for an appreciation for this kind of work.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we're supposed to turn it over to audience questions. So Jeremy, should you want to bring them from our online audience? Thank you. I could really ask you questions for the next hour and a half.
Thank you guys so much. This is really great. Can we get a little applause for our panel? It was so hard describing what I wanted this to be. And so you guys have done such an amazing job of validating the concepts. Thank you so much. So we're going to start with a few questions from the online audience, and then if we have time, we'll make room for a couple of questions from all the folks that are here in person. First question, and you guys have actually kind of touched on a lot of these questions already, is from Catherine Girardo. What does the ideal podcast professional archives collaboration look like? And what are some other formats beyond podcasting? Again, I think you've touched on this a bit. Audio professionals could use to help bring your archival stories to your audiences.
Do you have the ideal archives relationship with the podcast? I'm curious.
Because it's my archive?
No, I'm actually thinking about the Fortunoff one because they're sort of an independent one. I'm taking over now.
Take over. It's a democratic operation.
Can you reframe that?
Well, she said, how would you describe the ideal podcast archive relationship? You have two very different models, and I wonder if either of them are the ideal, or if you would make a baby out of the two of them.
Sure, and I've actually worked with the third archive, with the Studs Terkel Radio Archive, which drew a season from their archive. The ideal of working with one's own archive is that, in the best case scenario, you have asked the questions that you want answered. I didn't always. And as I mentioned earlier to you, in my transcriptions, I transcribed all my own interviews, I have notes where I say, why didn't you just keep your mouth shut? Because I didn't let people speak. With Studs Terkel's archive, it was even worse because he makes himself very much a part of the conversation. There's no ideal relationship. It's what you make of it. And generally there's enough material to draw from that you don't have to worry so much about the relationship. I like working with my own interviews because they have deeper meaning to me than working with someone else's archive. Doesn't mean I can't bring someone else's archive into that world.
I can speak from the perspective of the archives, actually. And I will say, it takes quite a bit of work to make audio available to the public and usable to the public. You need a robust digital preservation system. You need key access modes. You need description that makes it accessible. When I was at the Brooklyn Historical Society, we experimented with a software called OHMS, the Oral History Metadata Synchronizer, which basically synced a transcript to the audio. So you could potentially word search a transcript and then find what you're looking for and then listen to it. If you think about reading a book, you can kind of skip around or use an index to get where you want. When you're listening to audio, as your colleague at the Fortunoff archive knows, like it is long listening. And if you're handing somebody a jump drive and saying, go at it, that's an enormous amount of time. And so there are, this is again, the below the iceberg is the remarkable expertise and resources that go into making audio available are sometimes much more research intensive than a traditional paper archive.
And there are newer technologies like Descript that allow things to be transcribed and you can search within them. Right now, we're looking for, within the various Holocaust archives, for testimony from people who were gay and lesbian or LGBTQ. None of the archives have keywords, gay,
Yeah,
homosexual,
of course.
any of that.
Yeah.
It's very hard to search massive archives without those words. So we find deviant or other things, and we've been looking. But it is a massive amount of material. And just to give an example of how the technology has shifted, when I first donated my collection to the New York Public Library in 2008, I donated cassette tapes. They were going to be transferred to gold CD-ROMs.
Yep.
The library took so long to do the collection, digitize the collection, that it was digital MP3s, but now it's .wav.
Yeah.
So how, as an archive, and I'm curious
Yeah.
actually, how do you manage the transition from technology to technology without losing the data?
Well, it's actually so interesting because we are so much better at taking care of, not we, archives in general, the field, are better at taking care of analog media than we are at early digital. Early digital is the most endangered the form of AMI that exists. So there are all of these sort of little weird file types that were during the wild west of early digital years. They're incredibly difficult to preserve. So like we kill wax cylinders. We will digitize your wax cylinder till the cows come home, and your VHS and your analog tapes, but it's these funny little middle of the road digital files that are challenging. But again, there are these, very importantly, these new digital preservation systems that are now specifically designed to deal with this.
Thank you. I think we're going to ask one more question from the online audience, and then we'll move over to you guys here at the Center for Jewish History.
Yeah.
What?
Exactly.
Short answer.
Ruthless.
Yes.
So the other question that I have is, this is interesting. I'm actually really curious about this for Exile, quite frankly. How do you, but I'd love all your responses. How do you fill in missing plot point that you don't have on tape, but you know, or documented, and but through letters or other research? And this is from Jill Barchet, who is a Podcast Academy member.
Well, if you know it through a letter, it's I mean, that's the luckiest thing, but it doesn't always happen. And this is something that we've had to deal with in every story, because most archives, that there's that eureka moment that sounds so good when so you can hear the shuffling of papers and somebody gets it out, like, oh my God, I can't believe I found the answer to this mystery. But most of what you find in archives is just more mysteries, just answers to questions you weren't asking that leads to another mystery. And I think one approach is to make that mystery and that gap part of the subject matter, and then frankly, a little bit of speculation I think is okay. I mean, we're working on it's interesting talking what your remark, Eric, about the fact that gay, queer, homosexual, not necessarily subject matter terms that show up a lot in finding aids or catalogs. And we're working on a story right now with someone that we just happen to know was gay because he escaped Vienna, came to New York, and was arrested in a raid in 1944 in a gay bar, and was charged, under the section of the New York State Penal Code that was basically made being gay in public illegal. And there's this whole incredible story that we think we know about who his partner was, who was trapped in Budapest and saving people. And we've been going through this, and I've been racking my brain and, trying to search in Hungarian, which I don't speak, trying to establish something about this guy. I think in the end, we're going to have to tell the story and say, we think that these two, were together. But we can't say it definitively. It would be dishonest to suggest that we could. But I think it's also a teachable moment about, how history works, how evidence works, and also how some histories are more visible than others because of the way, things like sexualities and races are marginalized.
I think also this is the point where podcasting is so well suited to what Julie was talking about before, of like making apparent the process. It's actually exciting to say, and I was Googling in Hungarian at 2 a.m. And
Exactly.
nobody even used the term queer back then. And like you can actually show yourself a little bit as the producer and also give that's interesting,
It's transparency.
Yeah.
Just there's no shame in not knowing.
Right.
And we've with Stonewall Uprising, which we covered in a 5-part season, we have multiple voices, some of them contradictory. We have 3 people who tell the story of the founding of One Magazine, which was founded in the early 50s by an organization called One Incorporated. 3 people who founded it, and each of them tells the story differently, and they argue with each other. We have them arguing, we intercut the tape, and they contradict each other.
Yeah.
Whose story is right?
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say really briefly at StoryCorps, it's interesting because our production department will do something sometimes called askbacks, where if there's a StoryCorps interview that it seems like there might be more there, they will ask the participants to come back and do another interview. Or if there's an interview where something is referenced and the production department wants to find out more, they can record additional StoryCorps interviews with new participants. And so I love that concept because it becomes very circular. The podcast itself is adding to the archive. These interviews are being added to our collection and used to enhance, the work that they're doing.
I just had tell me when.
No, go.
I had an email from the niece of a woman named Ernestine Eckstein. We were talking about this earlier. We found this interview in the New York Public Library archive from 1965. She famously was on the cover of The Ladder, magazine for lesbians, in the 1960s. First African-American woman on the cover of the magazine.
We have that too.
I know you have that. And no recorded interviews with her. But by chance, we found one from 1965, which we made an episode out of it. An amazing interview. Her niece heard the episode when she was researching the aunt that no one in the family talked about. And just day before yesterday, emailed me to ask how she could get access to the full interview. So I will be forwarding her email to the person sitting right next to me here on the page, so she can listen to her aunt's interview from 1965. So things do get added. I had an email from the nephew of Wendell Sayers, cousin of Gail Sayers, famous football player. The nephew was upset that I had misidentified his parents. So we got to correct that on our website. But you never know where things are going to come from.
Yeah.
Because you put your podcast out there.
And it's just audience. It's not some like vanity numbers game. It's about actually helping people understand their past. I think that can be totally lost when we just talk about like download numbers. Like it's that's important too. But Go ahead, Jeremy.
Okay, I think we're going to maybe say goodbye to our online audience, wherever you are out there across the globe. And sadly, you might miss some of the questions that we're going to have here with our in-person attendees. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Podcast Academy. Thank you, Center for Jewish History. And of course, thank you, LBI, for hiring me to do this. It's been such an amazing project to work on. And does anyone here have a question? Okay. Few questions. All right. And just give us your name and.
Hi, my name's Barry, and I have a question kind of like open to all of you, and that is, have you found censorship or difficulty in exposing anti-Semitism or injustices? I could give 1 or 2 quick examples. One would be there were historical videos on YouTube talking about racism during the Civil War, and they got flagged as offensive and taken down. That's probably a good example. But also, for example, the don't say woke laws, which say that in education, pretty much don't say anything which isn't, happy and pretty much patriotic. So,
Or don't say
are
good.
you
Yeah.
facing difficulty in exposing things because of censorship? That would be the broad question.
Um, I don't know that censorship is the right word, but for a Holocaust institution, you run into basically a brick wall when it comes to online advertising and social media algorithms. When you use terms like anti-Semitism, even Jewish history, Holocaust, I've tried to run Google ads for exhibitions and public programs. Same thing on Facebook. There is just no nuance to allow for scholarly discussion of these things, and there's nobody to call. So that's an issue I've run into personally and have not actually heard a lot of discussion about because, frankly, like online marketing is such a minuscule part of my job. I hit the brick wall and just stop. But I think that's an interesting topic and a real problem on the internet in general. I would say with the podcast hasn't been an issue. Then I think it's more about some of these other issues, corporate consolidation and the network effect kind of all coming under the umbrella of a few big companies, and that's the bigger challenge. But I think then those two dynamics can work together, and it could be a problem at some point. I don't know.
Okay, we have another question. What is your name? Hi, my name is Ben. I'm a podcast producer and editor, and I'm curious when you guys are, tasked with creating a singular piece of narrative media, and you have what is, hopefully this, vast, robust archive to work with. Where do you start with, trying to create a singular story with an arc? Like, do you edit these archives as you come across them? Where do you start with trying to use this archive in a way to build a singular, satisfying arc?
I'm looking over here. Is there anybody over there? I could say I was not deliberate with my own archive. Like you, I had some favorites in my archive. It was very easy putting together the first season. We had no expectation of another season after that, so I picked my 10 favorites. We've had 12 seasons now, so it gets more complicated as you move along, and we've done more different things than just single person, single episode. So you get more creative. We did thematic seasons. We did seasons based around specific issues. It's I think imagine it's different for everybody, but within a specific episode, I don't find it hard to pull out the arc, but it's not always there right up front. You have to, because people don't speak in a linear way, just as I'm not speaking in a linear way now. You can pull the narrative thread out, then you have to reconstruct the interview so that it sounds like it is chronological and narrative. Just a quick example, Sylvia Rivera, another trans icon, I interviewed in 1989. I did know who Sylvia was then. Sylvia was drinking heavily during the interview. So by the end of the interview, Sylvia was quite drunk. But a lot of what she said at the end needed to go at the beginning. So how do you edit it to sound consistent?
She's getting sober.
Yeah. Right. So the key is finding narrative thread and arc.
I also think it's interesting when you say the archive, like there's the archive, like I'm working with a specific collection, but then there's also the archive writ large of just like primary sources. And I think in some ways that's complicated in a different way. When we were making Welcome to Your Fantasy, I mean, the sense that there was a nugget of a story there started when I started going through old LA Times headlines, and I realized there were some very surprising, counterintuitive things about this male strip club that I just thought was like a talk show phenomenon. And then we went about doing what all historians do to find like other archival evidence. Okay, can we get some videos? Can we get some old talk shows? And then we started actually having almost creating an archive, because then we went out and found people who were part of this and interviewed them. And we realized by the end of this, we'd created the only Chippendales archive out there. And so we're actually still kind of thinking of like, what should we do with it? I mean, it was over a year of work. Yeah, so we'll
New
see.
York Public Library.
Right? Perhaps, perhaps the exotic dance collection. Yeah,
That's another issue. A lot of people have audio archives,
right.
and we keep finding reel-to-reel tapes that don't last forever. And where do you get them? Who can take them? Who can
Right.
afford to digitize them?
There's not a lot of places.
Not a lot of
also
places.
tough.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
Hi there, my name's Tanya. I'm also a podcaster, worked on a history podcast. My question is, there are different sort of oral history archives. There's some that are more personal, there's some that are more, emotive and regular people. And then you have the very historical based oral history by preservationists. If you're working with that sort of an archive, how much of a inside baseball perspective are you taking? Should you be sort of trying to make that information accessible, or should you just be staying in your lane?
Do you have an example?
Yeah. For example, if you're working with the oral history archives of archivists.
The difference between the oral historians who do oral histories, they are different, often different creatures than someone's oral history given in a way that is more conversational. I prefer conversation.
Yeah, I think it depends. Like they have different value. I think that the traditional, or I mean, it's really interesting actually. So having been trained in a somewhat conventional way, or a traditional way, I should say, around oral history, the whole point there in a lot of ways is to remove the interviewer from the interaction. Like you are supposed to be, and of course that never totally happens, right? Because you're sitting there with this person, but it's the opposite. I remember when I hosted Welcome to Your Fantasy, and like actually the value was in the rapport and like our us coming out as like having a relationship. That's fundamentally different. But I think if it's like, a produced podcast, you can use those in very different ways and they will provide value in really different ways.
And you can extract the interviewer. So the Fourth Rough Archive did pretty formal interviews. The frustration was that they sometimes didn't ask the follow-up question that I would ask as a non-oral historian. Some of the interviews were people who were actually gay, who we've identified, and the interviewer says, "We don't need to get into that." Or the interviewee says, "Well, I don't need to tell you that story," and they move on because the interviewer is uncomfortable, or just it's not germane to the oral history that they're taking. But there's stuff to be extracted from all of these interviews, and that's the beauty of what we do is that we get to take those snippets. You don't need a lot. For a 30-minute episode, you don't need a lot.
No.
I have just an anecdote that I'm not sure what the bearing on podcasts is, because this didn't make it into the podcast, but one of the subjects of our first season was Eva Kolisch, who was on a kinder transport, escaped Austria, and became sort of a radical activist in the communist movement in the immediate post-war years. Then kind of a pioneering women's studies and gay rights movement scholar and gay rights movement activist. She actually just died in the last couple of weeks.
There was a big over.
Yeah.
At times.
And I mentioned that we have these oral histories that are done by young conscientious objectors who, when Austria had mandatory military service, it used to be mostly men. They instead spend a year doing interviews with people who had left Austria. And I knew the guy who interviewed Eva Kolisch, and I think just a couple snippets of the interview made it into the episode. But I went back and listened to the whole interview, and it was the sweetest thing ever. It was not professional in any sense, but she talked about her life and her experiences, and then started asking him questions, and then was giving this 21-year-old Austrian advice about life and politics, and standing up for what you believe in, and kind of counseling him on how to react when you feel despair because the world isn't changing in the way you want it to. I mean, that's just an incredible thing. You know, maybe we'll release it as a little single or something. But yeah, I mean, there's something to be said for material that isn't collected in a professional or systematic way. Not that we're not consummate professionals at the Leo, but
I think I would like to push back on this a little bit, though. I actually think Natalia's right. The way that oral historians are largely trained today is to really create space for someone else to lead their story, right? When that sounds really lovely and actually fascinating for a podcast, but actually to me, I'm like, oh, so he's mansplaining her. Like he was making it. I don't know if this is the case, but I've listened to a lot of interviews where the interviewer makes it about what they want, not actually about what the story that person needs to tell. Everybody tells stories about themselves in a way that is somewhat rehearsed. We all have a story of our life. The best kind of oral historian can use breaks and silences and even discomfort to draw out new stories, to complicate those narratives that we tell about ourselves. So I think that the capturing conversation is really lovely. And I think actually that there's a back and forth to podcasts that I think is so important. But actually, when we're thinking about oral histories, the most remarkable oral histories that I heard are when the narrator says almost nothing, but with their gentle direction or empathic gaze, or tell me more about that. You mentioned this, and then just let them go. That is where you get the true primary source, and so that is just, I just wanted to give that pitch out for the practice of oral history.
That's such an important point, and I learned it as I went along, and from hearing the interviews that I did, and I learned that the best way to keep myself quiet was to put my finger over my
It's true.
lips to remind myself not to say anything.
Yes. When I train people, I say pause and time it, and you think it's 15 seconds, it's 3.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? We want to fill space, and sometimes I will even say to people that I'm interviewing, I'm gonna pause, and it's gonna feel weird, but that's not because you're doing anything wrong. It's because you're doing something right, and the idea is to create something new.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have one last question.
Hi, I'm Will. I'm a podcast producer, and I'm kind of want to ask your help in pitching this to a client I'm working with, because I love the idea of creating an archive, and I also like the idea of revealing the process. And so I'm working with a print media company that has a print archive, but hasn't really thought about audiovisual stuff, ironically, even though they're producing podcasts, current podcasts. But I'm trying to convince them to think about collecting oral histories of staff who've been there for 40 years and they have not recorded. They even had an event to honor them, but did not record it. And also to get them to think about why it would be relevant to their readership to hear about this story. Like I asked, the question put to me was, well, why would a 30-year-old want to listen to that? Because they think only 30-year-olds listen to podcasts. Why would they care about the history of this institution? So I'm just wondering, like, how do you pitch it to a company that has the resources, the money to do it, and say, think about recording these people and also actually thinking about telling the story of you as an organization beyond just the reporting that you do?
It's very hard. I had this conversation with one of the old line gay rights organizations, Lambda Legal, very important organization. Most of the founders are still alive. Began conversation several years ago about interviewing all of the early members for their own archive. They didn't want to devote the resources. There wasn't a person on staff to do it. Their archives are a mess. Don't quote me. Thank goodness we're not on Zoom. And it's very frustrating. I think you have to make the case over and over again, and also make the point that the 30-year-old today will be 60 years old in 30 years, and they may be very interested, and that this organization has a place in history, and they won't be able to capture those interviews 30 years from now. So it's not expensive to capture those interviews now. They will be later.
I also, I mean, it would really depend on what organization it is, and I understand why you're not sharing it in this big room. But I also think, every single company and organization is talking about culture, like that they need culture and they need like their own institutional something. from the perspective of like an internal podcast, if it's a big enough organization that it's worth your time and energy, these big marquee brands, it could actually be really interesting to do something where you are telling the story of a company and how it shaped the culture, et cetera. That's different from making it for the whole world. But I think there's value in that too. And I think that might be easier to get the buy-in for. And there's also might be more money because it's branded and yeah.
Just for the purpose of full disclosure, Will Coley was one of the early freelancers working on making gay history.
Ah, okay.
So glad you're here, Will.
Okay, well, I think that's the end of our first Archives to Earbuds panel discussion. Thank you all for being a part of that, and thank the audience for being a part of it. Again, thanks to the Podcast Academy, to the Association of Independence in Radio, to the Center for Jewish History, and of course to the Leo Baeck Institute for making this event and this series possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.